The own goal. On June 22, 1994, in Pasadena, California, Andres Escobar stepped into a cross that should have been harmless and turned it into one of the most infamous moments in World Cup history. Colombia had arrived in the United States with huge expectations. Many thought this team could make a deep run. Instead, against the host nation, one touch changed everything. The ball came in low from the American left. Escobar stretched his right leg to cut it out. Instead, he redirected it past his own goalkeeper and into the net. The United States won 2-1. Colombia was suddenly staring at elimination, and the pressure around that team became suffocating. In 1994, Colombian football was tangled up with money, violence, and the wider criminal chaos of the country. A defeat was never just a defeat. Escobar did not hide from it. After the tournament, he returned home to Medellin. He wrote that life did not end here, that everyone had to keep moving forward. 10 days after the own goal on July 2nd, he was outside a nightclub when he was confronted and shot to death. Even now, the exact motive is still discussed and not every detail has ever been fully proved. But his murder became the darkest symbol of how football, gambling, power, and violence had fused together in Colombia at the time. That is what makes the image so haunting. A defender trying to do the right thing. One desperate touch. Then a stadium in America, a country in shock, and a man who never got to live beyond the mistake people remembered him for. One final headbutt. On July 9, 2006, in Berlin, Zinedine Zidane played the last match of his career. It was the World Cup final, France against Italy, and the stage could not have been bigger. He scored early from the penalty spot with a chipped finish off the underside of the bar. It looked like the perfect ending was setting itself in place. France's captain, already one of the defining players of his era, walking out of football with the trophy in his hands. Instead, the final act became something else. In extra time, after an exchange with Marco Materazzi, Zidane turned and drove his head into the Italian defender's chest. The referee sent him off. France lost on penalties. One of the most gifted players the tournament had ever seen did not leave the field as a champion. He left it alone, past the World Cup trophy, with a red card attached to the last minutes of his career. That image is why the moment still feels surreal. Not because football had never seen violence before, it had. Not because great players had never lost control, they had. It feels surreal because of who it was, when it happened, and what was on the line. This was not a group match in the heat of June. It was the World Cup final. It was Zidane's last night. And the man at the center of the sport decided, in a single burst of anger, to destroy the script everyone thought they were watching. Years later, even Zidane said he was glad the headbutt had been punished. That does not make it less shocking. It just confirms that the moment was real, irreversible, and impossible to take back. A street of hooligans. On June 21, 1998, in Lens, France, Daniel Nivel was doing his job at the World Cup. He was a French police officer assigned to the chaos around the match between Germany and Yugoslavia. What happened came one of the darkest images of tournament violence in modern football. A group of German hooligans found him in the street and attacked with overwhelming force. This was not a quick clash and it was not ordinary crowd trouble. Nivel was beaten by around 30 men. He was kicked and stamped on after he fell. He went into a coma for 6 weeks. He survived, but he never truly recovered. Years later, the damage was still there. He was paralyzed on one side, lost his sense of smell and taste, and lost sight in one eye. The attack shocked Germany itself. Helmut Kohl called it a national scandal. Long after the tournament ended, Daniel Nivel remained part of the story because his injuries did not end when the headlines did. He carried the consequences for the rest of his life, and German football carried the shame with him. That is what makes this case so brutal. There was no tactical foul, no bad challenge, no heat-of-the-moment shove in the stands. This was a pack attack in broad daylight during the biggest tournament in the sport. The World Cup sells crowds in color, songs in the air, flags on shoulders, faces painted in hope. In Lens, it gave the world another picture. A man on the pavement, boots around him, and football stripped down to pure ugliness. The Football War. In June of 1969, the World Cup qualifiers between Honduras and El Salvador looked on the surface like football matches charged with nationalism. In reality, both countries were already sitting on a political and social fault line. Land disputes, economic inequality, and tensions around Salvadoran migrants living in Honduras had been building for years. The qualifiers did not create that crisis from nothing. They poured fuel onto it. The first match was played in Tegucigalpa. The second was in San Salvador. The atmosphere around both games was vicious. Crowds screamed through the night outside team hotels. Newspapers turned football into patriotic warfare. Every result was treated like a national insult. By the time the teams met again in a playoff in Mexico City, the sport was no longer really the center of the story. It had become a stage for anger that was already waiting to explode. Only weeks later, El Salvador launched military action against Honduras. The conflict would become known as the Football War, which is a dramatic name, but also a misleading one if taken too literally. This was not a war caused only by a game. It was a war rooted in land, migration, and political failure. Football simply became the loudest, most visible spark. That is why the story still lands so hard. The World Cup is supposed to be a release valve, a place where nations compete inside rules, inside lines, inside 90 minutes. In 1969, those lines were not enough. The noise spilled out of the stadium, crossed the border, and turned into real gunfire. Maradona falls. On June 25, 1994, at Foxborough Stadium in Massachusetts, Diego Maradona helped Argentina beat Nigeria at the World Cup in the United States. He was 33 years old, heavier than in his prime, but still magnetic. Just days earlier, he had scored against Greece and screamed straight into a camera lens with wild eyes, one of the most unforgettable celebrations of the decade. It looked like a comeback. It looked like one last run from the biggest star in the tournament. Then the picture changed. At halftime against Nigeria, Maradona was selected for a drug test. Days later, the result came back positive for ephedrine and related banned substances. He was removed from the tournament. The most famous player in the World Cup was suddenly gone, not because Argentina had lost, not because of injury, but because the entire comeback had collapsed in a laboratory. The fall was enormous because Maradona never entered a stadium quietly. Everything around him felt mythic. Even in decline, he still bent the camera toward himself. That made the ending harsher. 1994 should have been the late chapter where he returns to the world stage one last time and drags Argentina forward on charisma alone. Instead, it became the moment where his World Cup story closed in humiliation. There is a reason that footage still lingers. Maradona leaving the field hand in hand with the nurse after the Nigeria match. The smile, the crowd, the sense that something was slightly off but not yet broken. Then the announcement, the test, the expulsion, and the feeling that one of football's greatest careers had just hit a wall in full view of the world. The cost of Qatar. On November 20th, 2022, the World Cup opened in Qatar with fireworks, ceremony, and a polished global show. New stadiums glowed in the desert. Transport links were ready. Hotels were full. The tournament looked futuristic, controlled, and expensive. But long before the opening match, another story had already attached itself to the event and refused to go away. The World Cup had been built by migrant labor, and rights groups spent years arguing that too many of those workers had paid too much for it. Reports described unpaid wages, unsafe conditions, injuries, heat exposure, and deaths linked to the wider system that delivered stadiums, roads, hotels, and infrastructure. Qatar did introduce labor reforms before the tournament, and international bodies acknowledged some of those steps. But the criticism never disappeared, because the reforms were seen by many as too late, too narrow, or too weakly enforced. After the World Cup ended, the argument continued. Amnesty urged FIFA to publish and act on a review of its responsibilities toward workers harmed in delivering the tournament. The organization pushed for remedy and compensation. AP, meanwhile, noted that Qatar had won praise for some labor law changes, but was still being urged to go further. That tension is what defines the story. Progress existed. So did unresolved harm. So when people remember Qatar 2022, they remember Messi, the final, the penalties, the spectacle. But they also remember the question hanging behind all of it. What did this tournament cost the people who built it? Not in dollars. In wages, in safety, in health, and in lives that never got the same attention as the men on the pitch. The Dictators Tournament. On June 1st, 1978, the World Cup opened in Argentina. The host nation wanted a month of noise, flags, and patriotic triumph. General Jorge Rafael Videla's military dictatorship wanted something even more valuable. It wanted legitimacy. It wanted bright television pictures, packed stadiums, and a global celebration strong enough to blur what the regime was doing in the background. This was the period of Argentina's dirty war. Thousands were kidnapped, tortured, murdered, or made to disappear under the junta. One of the regime's most notorious sites was the former Navy School of Mechanics, known as ESMA, a clandestine detention and torture center in Buenos Aires. While matches were being played and the country chased its first world title, prisoners were still part of that same landscape. Argentina won the tournament. The final at the Monumental ended in celebration, and those images became part of national football mythology. But 1978 has never belonged only to football. It also belongs to the dictatorship that understood exactly what the World Cup could do for its image. A trophy could be used like a curtain. A goal could drown out a scream. A month of sporting pride could make outsiders look at confetti instead of prison cells. That is why Argentina 1978 still feels wrong in a way that other champions do not. The team lifted the cup, but the tournament itself remains stained. The footage is bright, the context is dark, and the closer you look, the less it feels like a celebration and the more it feels like a regime borrowing football's beauty to hide its own violence. If you liked this video, hit subscribe for more like it, and let me know in the comments what you want to see next.